Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Today, actually, we're having an interview session with Dr Arvind Singh Mandair, and they used to live in Coventry, and they've moved to the States. So today's program will be to discuss about the academics in the Sikh world and about what they have done. And I think you will be quite surprised at the amount of information that they've put out in terms of books, journals, and all the other work that we're going to hopefully talk to Arvind about. So first of all, let me introduce Arvind to everybody. Arvind, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So welcome to the show. And let's first start just by talking about your background and growing up in the UK, especially here in Coventry. So why don't you start by telling me,
Sure.
when you came over, your parents and your brothers and sisters and so on, and where you studied.
First of all, thank you for having me on the Sikh Channel. It's an honour. I'm very humbled. I came to the UK in 1966 with my parents. I was about two and a half years old at the time. I remember, well, I don't remember much, but I remember getting off the plane and actually feeling the cold of a new country. After that, I grew up. I went to a Church of England primary school. I was influenced, obviously, by the heavily Christian atmosphere that I was educated in. Then went to a grammar school, King Henry VIII Grammar School in Coventry, which was established in 1545. It's one of the oldest grammar schools. And after that, my education was at the Coventry University. Then I went to Aston University to do a PhD in chemistry. I was married at the age of, I can't remember the age I was married, I was about 27 or so, to Preet Mahinder Kaur from India. We have been happily married ever since. After that, I changed my academic field from chemistry to Sikh studies and philosophy. So I went into the study of philosophy at the University of Warwick, and I actually had a job there at the time, studying philosophy. Actually, before that, I was doing superconductors at the University of Warwick. I had a research fellowship and was in the physics department. After that, I really got into affairs in the UK Sikh community. There was so much going on. This was the late 80s, early 90s. So much politics going on, and there's a misrepresentation of Sikhi in the air, and it was impossible not to get involved. I decided then to change my subject area from science to study philosophy, which became my base discipline. I took a master's in philosophy at the University of Warwick. This was while I was still a research fellow there. So I was holding down one job and then studying on the other hand. And then after that, I decided to go on and do a PhD in philosophy and Sikh studies. And that took about, I think, from 1991 to about 1998 to make that transition complete. Would you like me to say?
Yes. What I mean? Did you study in? You did your PhD in Warwick University.
I did my first PhD in chemistry at Aston University.
Right.
And the first PhD was in Aston. The second was at the University of Warwick. But it was a combined PhD where I had a philosophy tutor at Warwick and a religions and Sikh studies tutor at the University of London.
And that was Professor Shackle, was
Professor Christopher Shackle, yes.
Okay. All right. No, let's just talk a couple of minutes about SOAS, where Professor Shackle was, I assume. He's no longer, he's retired now.
No, he's retired.
So is that where all of the Sikh studies in the UK is done, from SOAS, or can you do them from any other university?
Well, SOAS is known as the place where Hugh MacLeod did his PhD. Hugh MacLeod was one of the preeminent scholars of Sikhism from the 1960s onwards, and in fact many regarded him as the kind of founder or the father figure in modern Sikh studies. He did his PhD in '68, I think, from SOAS, It was in Sikh history and it focused on the Janam Sakhis. Incidentally, Professor J.S. Garewal is also equally preeminent scholar from Punjab, did his PhD at the University of London, SOAS. That was followed by Christopher Shackle, who was specialized in linguistics and particularly in languages such as Urdu, Persian, but also in Punjabi. He studied the scriptures. So that laid a foundation for other scholars to sort of come to SOAS to study Sikhi, Punjabi language and related subjects. So SOAS had a history since the late 1960s in this area, and after that, I think in the late 1990s, other universities started to sort of produce scholars who had some kind of a specialization in one aspect of Sikh studies or another.
Okay. I mean, let's talk about the chair that you actually hold as the associate professor at the University of Michigan. Mm-hmm. Now, when I was searching for chairs, and we'll try to explain to the Sikh Channel Sangat exactly what a chair means, there is no chair of the equivalent that you're doing in the States, and there's about 6 or 7 here in the UK. So can you just explain what this whole chair means, and why is it that we haven't got one in the UK?
Yes, it's quite a long-winded sort of answer that I'm going to give you. So a chair is an endowed position. So you can have a chair, for example, in mathematics, in religion, and this one happens to be in Sikh studies. The idea of a chair is that it's an endowed position which is made permanent through a major contribution from a donor, and that donor can be the community, or it can be a single relatively affluent person who gives a donation, let's say of $1 million, $2 million, pounds, whatever. That then endows a position, a faculty position, for somebody to be able to become a permanent faculty member in perpetuity, basically. What the university does is to advertise that position worldwide. There is a long-winded search where people compete for that position, so a lot of people are interviewed, and obviously the most suitable person will get that position. That doesn't tell you what a chair actually does, which I'll go into more as we get into this particular discussion.
Okay, but why is it then that, so in America, if a family or the community has put up enough funds for it, then they can set up a chair in Sikh studies?
Yes.
So what is it that in the UK that we haven't been able to set a chair up to study for the Sikh faith?
It has something to do with the relationship between the Sikh community and the university in both countries. Sikhs who came to America were very, very well educated when they first came there. A lot of them went into the professional sector. So in the 1970s and 80s, there was a felt need on behalf of the community, on the part of the community, to project a positive image of Sikhs. The Sikhs were not very well known at all in the United States. They were confused and still are confused with Muslims, with Arabs. So I think the first occasion where the whole idea of a chair came about was 1976. There was a conference at the University of California, Berkeley, which is organized by Mark Juergensmeyer, who's a leading professor there. There was that resulted in a major conference on Sikh studies where all the major scholars, including Hugh MacLeod and a number of others, were brought together to discuss issues on Sikh studies. And I think it was Mark Juergensmeyer who put out at that time the idea that there ought to be a Sikh chair, that members of the community should contribute something for the longevity of this, the study of Sikhism, because there were chairs in Hinduism, in Buddhist studies, in Christianity and Judaism. There have been chairs for several hundred years. But this would have been the first chair. So this began, and obviously by the early 80s, you have the political turmoil in Punjab, where Sikhs are now being branded as fundamentalists, as terrorists, etc. So there was a need to change that kind of imagery, and the the university was perceived as a place from which some kind of change could happen, partly by bringing the study of Sikhs and Sikhi to the non-Sikh public, as well as educating the heritage tradition.
Okay, so what, I mean, it's quite expensive, I assume, to have a chair anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that doesn't explain why in the UK we haven't had a chair. There's lots of scholars here. I think they've written a number of books. In the academic side, there were people like you and I both know, Eleanor Nesbitt, Owen Cole. There was Sambi Saab, who's passed away. There was a number of people here in the UK. How come? What is the main reason for not setting up a chair in the UK?
I think it requires a certain understanding on the part of the community of the importance of the university in projecting a particular image of the subject area that you're interested in. So if it's Jewish studies, it would project an image of Jews in a particular way. The way that the system works in the West, the state is connected to the university sector in a very intimate way. And I don't think our people, when they first came here, they mostly went into labouring jobs. And I think there wasn't enough knowledge about this. People just weren't aware of the value of education and particularly educating oneself in the humanities and specifically in Sikh studies. It was thought that this kind of area was well taken care of by the authorities, the SGPC, and of course the Gurdwara sector, but of course it isn't.
Okay, I mean the Gurdwara plays no. I mean the SGPC plays no part, as far as I know, in any of the universities. Is it? It's like totally independent.
Totally.
Okay, that brings me on to this question about the Granthis that we have in India, who are learning or doing Yaniship courses, and then they become Gathavachiks. I mean, they obviously have a different method of learning. I mean, a lot of it is, repetitiveness in terms of kota lalo, and onu repeat kari jao. It's the same stories that we've been hearing for years, and so the West has obviously got a different way of how we think about something. We'd rather write something and read it as opposed to just memorize it.
Right.
So how does that work with the Gathavachiks teaching things in Gurdwaras and what you're trying to do in the academic world? Is there a sort of a bridge between the two or not?
There is some kind of a bridge. I mean, we have to operate within the Western sector. It has certain rules about the way one conducts scholarship. Scholarship is done on a peer review basis. So central to scholarship here is the our journals, for example, scholarly journals, scholarly associations, and publishing with a view to publishing articles and books that are then peer reviewed. Okay, that sets a certain standard. Now that sort of thing isn't quite translatable into the Punjabi domain. So there's a difference between cultures which value literate education as opposed to mostly work in the oral domain. I think the difference between orality and literacy is important to take into account here, because most of our traditions have come down through word of mouth. There is obviously a literate tradition as well, but the memorization aspect still is very, very important within Indic cultures broadly. So Sikhi, I think, fits into that general mold. Okay,
what about the people that are under you in terms of your professorship? I mean, are they? I mean, what sort of studies are they doing at the moment then that you're overseeing?
I have a number of PhD students who are working on different aspects. So I have one working on the 18th century traditions. He's working on the meaning of devotion in Sikhi. And he's looking at Janamsakhis specifically and taking a different look at Janamsakhis, because the whole topic of Janamsakhis was actually taken up by Professor Hugh MacLeod in the late 60s, and there's been very little work done since then. So this particular student, Harjeet Gariwal, his name, is studying Janamsakhis. I have another one who's looking at Gurmat camps and studying Gurmat camps and what part they've played in the transmission of heritage in the tradition. Another PhD, Niranjan Khalsa, she's from the 3HO community, is studying the Gurbani Renaissance, or the Renaissance in Gurmat Sangeet. So she's been interviewing a lot of the people now involved in the revival of Sikh musicology.
Right.
It's a very interesting PhD. And then there are several others who I'm sort of co-supervising. One is looking at Gathakars, and hence my interest in the realm of Gatha as well, which deeply influenced me as I came into the academic world. So I have a student called Punu Jaitla who's working on Gatha and actually analysing Gatha in the Punjabi context and also in the diaspora as well.
Okay, I mean, one of the things that when the academic world brings out something, and I want to talk about one particular gentleman, you know, who I don't know whether you must know him, which is who holds the chair at New York at the moment. No, he doesn't hold the chair at New York. He's the Peshawar Singh that wrote the book. Mm-hmm. Now, after he wrote his book on the Bhagats, I think it was, he was then, or Sheme Badshah, he was then summoned to the Akal Takht for some of the stuff that he had written that wasn't correct. So what rights do the people in SGPC have over a academic book or paper that someone has written? Mm-hmm. I mean, are they more scholarly, or do they have a hidden agenda by, you know, not telling everyone that actually we've been preaching maybe something that's incorrect? How does that work between the two?
It's a difficult question to answer it, and it opens up a huge can of worms, actually. But I'll try to answer it as simply as possible. Technically, from the Western point of view, what is regarded as a traditionalist body or a religious body like the SGPC wouldn't have any influence in scholarship. And we, in the West, freedom of expression, academic freedom, scholarly freedom is valued above just about anything else. I mean, the whole split between the church and the state that came about in the 15th, 16th century here was about scholars being able to say, you know, what they wanted in a way that they needed to say in order to challenge the domination of the church. Now, this doesn't quite translate back into the Sikh domain. So there were controversial elements, certainly with Hugh MacLeod, with the Hugh MacLeod's work, and also with, to my knowledge, with Professor Peshawar Singh's work as well. But I think the problem is that we didn't have a setup, if you like, a framework where these issues could be discussed before they went straight into the community and were discussed at a very popular level by people who didn't understand what was actually going on. So while there are inevitably going to be controversies, most of them minor, and in many cases there may not be controversies at all, but where there are, we need to have a forum to discuss these openly before they get out into the popular realm. I think the Christians, the Jews certainly have that kind of forum in place. Unfortunately, we don't. I think we need to think about constructing.
No, that's. I see why I asked you that question, because when I've read books that I think are going to be controversial, and they come out, I'm wondering whether when people write them, realise that actually what impact it will have on the wider audience, not just in the academic field. As we hear now, with people talking about you know, somebody could prove that ਪੰਜ ਬਾਣੀਆਂ ਅੰਮ੍ਰਿਤਸਰ ਜਦੋਂ ਹੋਇਆ ਉਦੋਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਪੜ੍ਹੇ ਗਏ ਨਾ ਜਾਂ ਲਿਖਤੀ ਰੂਪ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਦਾ, but oral tradition ਮਿਲਦਾ ਹੈ. And I'm wondering that you're on the borderline of offending people in many ways, but also telling them maybe the truth, which they don't want to necessarily hear because they've been hearing from such a young age, IGJ, and they don't want to change from their ways. And that is where I think maybe SGPC sort of puts a hold on people, and saying, okay, theek hai academic bande bhi hai. That's what I could never sort of sometimes relate. Otherwise, you'll be calling at everybody to the Akal Takht to tell them off for something, because it will never agree with what the mainstream is saying. Okay, I wanted to move on to actually about the books that you've written. And I know that the books that I have here are all actually yours, but I wanted to start off with the journal type which you first started, which was this one, which is the Sikh Reformer. So what made you start this magazine all those years ago? I remember reading this actually. What was the reason behind this that you started?
Oh, it's a long story. Actually, at that time, and I need to just go back to the narrative, which I kind of left half complete, but at the time I had, remember I said earlier I had switched to the study of philosophy. We were working within the Sikh community, and one of the problems that was constantly coming up was that we were bombarded by images in the media stereotyping us as fundamentalists, and there was no way to sort of change that at all. And many of these stereotypes came back to influence our second and third generation kids going into universities, into colleges, etc. A number of us started a society in Coventry called the Sikh Cultural Society. I joined at a relatively late stage, and one of the projects we wanted to do was to start a magazine which the second, third generation could read, because at the time there were plenty of Punjabi magazines, you know, Des Pradesh, Awaaz-e Qawm, etc. But very few of the second, third generation could actually read Punjabi to the level that was required to really understand and make sense of things. So we decided to do a magazine for the second generation Sikhs. The people involved were mostly myself, my colleague Shindar Thandi, who was a lecturer at Coventry University at the time, and my younger brother Navdeep. And we began by just taking up issues that were prevalent in the Gurdwaras at the time. So we talked about politics, actively talked about human rights issues, we wrote about those, and then took up issues of not just social justice, but those that were about Sikhi itself. The translation of Gurbani, for example, was something that we constantly spoke about, issues of sovereignty. So we took up all of these topics and put them into a magazine format, which went out mostly to the student community. And from what I remember in the 1990s, we used to go to some of the student camps and actually sell this ourselves. So we actually wrote the material, printed it, we had to find a printer, we had to raise the money for it, and then go out and have to sell it as well, on top of all the other things we did. But it had a very interesting influence on other students, because then you had, I think, several other magazines kicked off in English, and it was very obvious that something in English was absolutely necessary.
Right. There's always been a vacuum for that, I think. So, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, even now, to a certain degree,
Right.
you don't sort of get those magazines to the level that you're actually looking for. Which brings me on to this one,
Right.
which is the Sikh formation. So, I mean, you started this in sort of June 2005 was the first one.
Right.
And this is more like a journal, isn't it?
Oh, this is
This is definitely a scholarly journal. And it was done by Routledge. I mean, what made you, did you do this from the States, or was this done in the UK?
No, I had moved to the States at the time, and after this job at SOAS, I was headhunted for a job at Hofstra University as assistant professor and holder of the first chair, the Bindra chair in Sikh Studies.
Right.
And one of the tasks I envisaged there was to start a journal in Sikh Studies. There already existed a journal called the International Journal of Punjab Studies. The focus of that journal was mostly Punjab, which meant the broader Punjab, both Western Punjab and Eastern Punjab. So it catered for beyond what you might call religious lines. One of the things we felt was that it was marginalizing the Sikh element. So it was definitely the journal was published along secular lines, and it never questioned the secular framework within which most of the journals in area studies, etc., were published. What we did was to start this journal with a specific view of challenging the religion-secular binary. What that means is that in the West, the whole West works through this religion-secular binary. So if you're a religion, if you belong to something called a religion, you belong to the private sphere, the private domain, and if you're secular, if you get regarded as secular, you belong to the public domain. So this is public-private sort of boundary. We felt very strongly that Sikhi did not fit into that, because Sikhi is not necessarily a religion. It has become a religion, since the encounter with the West. And this is one of the aspects that really influenced our understanding in beginning this journal. We wanted to be able to write material from a Sikh standpoint, and the whole idea of a Sikh standpoint from Sikh experience was deeply problematized by other journals, etc. And Sikh Formations allowed us to do that. So the way we did, I put a proposal through with my colleagues, Gurdeep Singh and Bala Luwalia, who are both very senior academics. We put a proposal through to Routledge, never expecting it to be accepted, because, I mean, most global publishers are simply not interested in the Sikhs. We're too small, and for them, the journal wouldn't make money, which is what they're primarily interested in. But for some reason, it got accepted, and we've been publishing for the last 8 years. We publish articles on just about any topic to do with Sikhs, Sikhi. There are certain topics we'd like to cover more, but primarily we've covered all the disciplines: history, philosophy, particularly in the social sciences. It's very, very strong in the social sciences.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, let's move on to your books then, and I want to talk about, actually, briefly, because you have written 4 books, and this one, Sikh Religion, Culture and Ethnicity, was your first book.
It was an edited book, brought out. Yeah.
And you did this with Shackle as well then. So that was the time when you were studying at SOAS? I
had actually just finished studying, and I had a position at SOAS as a research and teaching fellow. Okay, and
this book here that you did, which was, I think, your second book, Teachings of the Sikh Gurus. Right. But this particular book, was this for a particular audience? I mean, or was it academic as well?
It's academic, definitely. But it's also for the general public as well. And what it was a translation project. The Penguin publishers approached Christopher Shackle, I think, back in 1998, and asked if he was interested in doing some new translations of Sikh scripture, because there weren't any new ones at that time. And Chris came back to me and says, "Would you like to work with me on this?" And I readily accepted the challenge, because I was already working on the idea of translation in my PhD. It's interesting, but my PhD in Sikh studies was on what I call cultural translation between Sikhi and the West, and the encounter between Sikhi and the West. So the whole idea of translation readily fit into that. But what we wanted to do something more than just translate Bani into English. What we were interested in is thinking about the framework by which we represent these hymns. And what you'll see in this book is a very interesting framework, which I think is closer to the underlying themes of the Guru Granth Sahib. And when you first come into contact with the Guru Granth Sahib at a reading level, one of the first things you notice in the hymns is the theme of finitude. Finitude meaning anything that exists will pass away. Okay, and we take it for granted, yet we never realize how prevalent it is throughout the Guru Granth. What we decided to do was to make that one of the underlying themes. So we translated the hymns and then divided them up into topics such as impermanence. So the idea of time in Sikhi came first, and we put certain hymns into that category. Then the next one was mind, self, ego, which is a hugely prevalent theme. And then other topics such as Shabad Guru. And then lastly, I think, was the notion of experience. So these were very different. I mean, this hadn't been done before, yet it corresponds more closely to what we think is Sikh experience. The normal way of translating Sikh scripture was done on a theological basis before that. So people would translate hymns and simply put them under, the topic of God, and then man, and then the world. But that framework is taken from Christianity. It's something that's been imported into Sikh studies and into the modern Sikh experience. and we wanted to kind of challenge that. So these are new new translations, but also a very new interpretation of Bani.
Okay, I mean, your third book, by far the biggest one, is this one, which is Religion and the Spectre of the West. So this is all your own book, isn't it?
Of course, yes.
This is nothing that you've done with anybody else. So
No.
what was the reason behind this one in terms of, is it the political translations of things that have been happening, or what?
This is a very complicated book, and I think you can tell that from the title. It's called Religion and the Spectre of the West, and the subtitle is Sikhism, India, Post-Coloniality and the Politics of Translation. So a lot of stuff going on there. Very simply, I was interested, my first interests were actually in Sikh philosophy. I wanted to work on Sikh philosophy. I wanted to look at the Bani and other Sikh literature and simply find ways of interpreting them, get across the message of what Sikhi was. And actually to try and delve into that message in far more detail than had been done before. But as soon as I came to that, and these are things that I actually did in the Sikh Reformer magazine as well, so they all come from that earlier period. But as soon as I started to research Sikh philosophy, it became obvious that there was 100 years of tradition that intervened, and that tradition was the modern period. It was the modern encounter between Sikhs and the West. So here we are, we're translating Sikh scripture into English. When second generation, third generation kids read scripture, the issue is that their mindset is already working according to Western categories. It's working in English. So even if they read in Punjabi, you naturally have to translate it into English. I mean, it's what we do when we're sort of brought up in a dominant culture. So there was the influence of the dominant culture that I was deeply interested in. And Religion and the Spectre of the West was a kind of a clearing project. It cleared the ground for me to be able to do Sikh philosophy. So I looked at specifically the encounter, the nature of the encounter between Sikhs and the West. How did Sikhs enter modernity? Was it just a neutral process? Or did something change in the whole framework of Sikhi? Who was responsible for this modern interaction, for creating what we call modern Sikhism? So I was interested in the difference between Sikhi and Sikhism, which are two very different things. So I'm challenging that. I'm challenging the ism as a Western creation.
Right. I mean, I have been hearing that a number of times now, even on TV and the radio, that we shouldn't be using the word Sikhism.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always said that we have to educate people.
Yeah.
It's so in us now. Okay, as you just ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, Sikhism ਬੋਲੀ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ, until we actually explain it properly.
Mm-hmm.
But let me bring on to the last book that I've got for you, which is this one here.
Mm-hmm.
Now this book is your fourth one, is it?
Right.
So what? I mean, this looks really heavy to me in terms of academic-wise.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the reason for publishing this book then?
This was a set of conference essays. We did a conference, my colleague and I, Marcus Dressler, we did a conference called The Politics of Religion Making. Now that links back to the earlier book, the Specter book. So I'd pretty much finished that book at the time. What does religion making mean? Effectively, it means that some cultures who call themselves religions now actually manufactured religion in the encounter with the British and the Europeans, and they did that as soon as they translated from one system to another. So we were deeply interested in what we call the politics of religion making. Central to that process was the basic framework of the modern West, which is secularism, and the divide between secularism and religion. So that book is exploring those issues, not just from a Sikh perspective, but we looked at, there were scholars who specialize in Islam, in the Indian traditions, in Buddhism, etc., who put those together and produced this volume called Secularism and Religion Making.
I mean, you've got two more books that are in progress as well, and we'll just touch on them quickly. One of them is Thinking Between Cultures, and the other one is Mourning Sovereignty. I mean, Thinking Between Cultures is coming out, is it this year, 2012?
Thinking Between Cultures is an ongoing project. Actually, the book that I've just finished now is called Sikhism, A Guide for the Perplexed.
Right.
And that is actually, it's the earlier book, but in diluted form, but it's written for the lay public. Because I know that the ordinary public will be slightly intimidated by, I think, the sheer depth of the Specter book. But you know, the guide for the perplexed would be at a layman's level.
Okay. And
so
what about the Morning Sovereignty book? Is that for the average person?
These will be slightly more for the. There'll be scholarly books. That's what I do in order to get promotion in the University Academy. So the two books you mentioned, Thinking Between Cultures, that's the original project that I wanted to do.
Right.
On Sikh philosophy. It's a book on Sikh philosophy, and my central theme in it is time, and I'm using that to look at certain key themes, such as Shabad Guru, the idea of Naam, and there are other topics that I've looked at as well. I'm just it's going out of my mind at the moment, but that is looking at what actually happened. So it's one thing to do something like Sikh philosophy and to write it down in English. So you've got a scripture which is written in Punjabi, but you're then translating those ideas into the Western context. What I'm looking at is what happens in between that process, the thinking between. My argument will be that we're actually changing as these two cultures encounter each other, the West and the Sikh, we're actually changing the boundaries between them. And something very interesting is actually happening to our consciousness itself, which we don't realize. We just think we're making the translation. Often the idea of translation just goes straight. You know, it's kind of repressed.
Okay. I mean, you know, I should point out that when Arvind first showed me these books, I was quite surprised because somebody quite young has managed to write so much. A lot of people don't write this much, even when they're like 80, in my opinion. I mean, they are definitely well worth books that people should read. They should definitely be in the Gurdwaras. And I will ask you this question about the Gurdwaras. You don't do lectures or kathas in Gurdwaras, do you?
I used to. This is where I first started. The whole Reformer project was doing katha in English and to some extent in Punjabi as well. But as I got, you know, with the whole switch from one field to another, it's very difficult to maintain the kind of academic rigor that we need and to do what we need to do, which is to teach courses and to have a very heavy research program to supervise students, and then to go into the Gurdwaras and be able to do that. It's something that I'm very much interested in. The way that I do it, however, is in conjunction with a local community that I'm working with. For example, the community who funded the chair that I hold at the moment at the University of Michigan, we just call it the Detroit community. They're mostly centered around Detroit. I hold an outreach program for them once a year. It's a week-long intensive set of lectures where I invite other people as well. And this is definitely, it's more orientated towards Katha, but done in English, although we use Punjabi as well. And we also explore important themes in the sacred language of the Sikhs, in Gurbani Vichar, Katha, etc., etc.
I want to talk to you about 1 second about the Gurbani Vichar. I mean, is it, I mean, of all the scholars that have been, when people talk about translations, they always refer to Professor Sahib Singh. Is that, I mean, there is nothing equivalent of that in English. I mean, it would be a mammoth task for anyone to do and have that much in-depth knowledge. Although I will say that Professor Puran Singh was one, or even Kapoor Singh, who did the Sukhmani Sahib translations, but they passed away before. They've only done like 4 Ashtpadiyas. They are very near to what Professor Sahib Singh has done, was probably in Punjabi. There is no translations of any of that type of work into English, as far as I know. I mean, is that something that when you talk about Gurbani translations or Vichar that you'd be looking at?
There's a lot of study. I mean, most of in the bigger book, The Religion and Spectre of the West, I'm actually analysing a lot of Sahib Singh's work and the so-called Sikh reformists of the early 20th
The Singh
century.
Sabha you're referring
The
to?
Singh Sabha period, Bhaivir Singh's work, etc. So there are people actively looking at that, reading it. I'm one of those people. to translate it into English would be a huge task, as you've quite rightly said. It requires time, and also we have to ask ourselves what would be the importance of those particular translations, apart from just having them translated, because they are encyclopedic volumes, basically.
Yes.
You know, it's a 10 volume set by Professor Sahib Singh himself. And then the whole issue, see, that set by Professor Sahib Singh is an interpretation of Gurbani. If you then translated Professor Sahib Singh's 10 volume, that would have to be an interpretation of an interpretation.
Yes.
Okay, so you're kind of diluting the interpretation at each stage, which is really interesting. But as I say, what would be the object? You need to kind of ask.
Let's talk about the new website that you're going to set up, the Sikh Studies Forum, and why you think there's a need for setting up a new website, which is the question that I usually ask everybody, simply because if there are organizations already doing the same type of work that you're doing, what is the need to set up a new website for Sikh Studies Forum?
When you say organizations doing the
yeah,
same
for example,
work,
in America, there are, we talked about, for example, there is an organization called the Sikh Coalition. There's an organization called the United Sikhs. Other academic organizations in the chairs that you have.
Right.
I mean, are they doing the same sort of thing that you'll be doing in the Sikh Studies Forum, or are you looking for something totally different?
No, it's quite different.
Okay, that's what I'm asking you.
Right.
I mean, where is that sort of a difference coming in, and
Right.
what was the need for that?
It's actually a very different project indeed. Organizations like as the Sikh Coalition, United Sikhs, are essentially activist and lobbyist groups. The site that we're setting up, which is Sikh Studies Forum, it's coming out of the old Reformer project. You probably, I think, cottoned on to the fact that I've moved from grassroots work that I did to very scholarly work with the journal, publishing the journal. Problem is with the journal, it's done at a very sort of academic level, which is not translatable down to the ordinary reading public. What we want to do is to get people to talk about those articles at a level that people can understand and translate it back through a lay language, if you like, on the web. So that's one aspect of the project, and the site will be set up around certain what we call key categories. The categories will be philosophy and ethics, social justice and politics, the arts, which includes music and literature, and also film, and a couple of others which escape me. Oral history is another one we're doing, which we've simply called memory, but it's actually cataloguing the oral history of communities. So as communities settle, and it's an ongoing process, we are trying to get students, sometimes these are intern students, to go out and interview people about their whole sort of immigration experience, their parents, because one generation is dying off, and we're trying to capture that as much as possible. So those are the key categories on the site. What we've got people to do is to be columnists on those particular sites. So these columnists can be people who are scholars, but they're also drawn from the community as well. They're people that I've worked with, and new people that I'm getting to know as well, who hold down professional jobs but are not necessarily scholars. So they will be writing at a lay level. So the articles will be much shorter, about 1,000 words to 2,000 words. But they're articles that, and also the website will allow us to respond at a very fast pace to events that are ongoing. And the idea is for then the general public to be able to blog these particular columns, if you like, and to begin a real debate.
Okay, well, I hope that works well. I mean, I have to ask you one question with the recent incident that happened at the Oak Creek Gurdwara. And, obviously what happened was a tragedy, but it brought, for Americans, it sort of highlighted that there is a group of Sikhs that shouldn't be confused with Muslims. And I mentioned to you that on the internet, what had happened was the amount of Google searches after that incident shot up, and then it dropped after 2 days. So people were interested about, okay, what are these people and so on. And I know that you put out a statement. When we put statements out as an organization, or as the Sikh group or from that Gurdwara, is there one particular group in America that has like a final say? Okay, this is what the official statement is. For example, if CNN wanted to interview someone, would they be contacting you, or did they contact the first Sikh person that has been working in the CNN? How does that work in America?
It's a good question. Really, I mean, these news agencies contact. They do a general Google search, as you quite rightly said, and come up with the ones who come highest in the search. And at the moment, it's the lobbyist group. They have put out statements, and quite rightly so, and I applaud them for doing that, for putting out statements as quickly as possible. But the final say, there is nobody who's going to have a final say. And let me talk about how I've sort of handled this at the University of Michigan. We thought about putting out an immediate statement straight away. So a colleague of mine, Professor Bogle, who works very closely with me at Hofstra University, put out a statement which went on the university website. What we're actually doing at the U of M is to organize a series of events. You put out these statements initially, they're short statements, and they express condolences, which is our first reaction. But the thing is, especially with the Western media, is that these incidents will be very quickly forgotten. So you have these images in the papers and on the website and the news for 2 or 3 days. Eventually they're completely forgotten. And people are then sort of having to search their sort of memory databases for, who are Sikhs again. And so we have a kind of amnesia, I think. What we've decided to do is to hold events at regular intervals. So we're holding a teach-in, for example, a student vigil in early September, where the student bodies, not just the Sikh body, this is not just a Sikh issue, it's much wider than the Sikhs. And this is something that we specifically picked on, is that it should not, the whole Wisconsin incident should not be seen as just as a Sikh issue. It's a problem with American society, and the way that the images of foreigners, of immigrants, and particularly those who are confused with Islam are sort of conjured in the American mindset. So what we did was to hold a student vigil, which will happen in early September. Then in late September, we're having a teach-in where faculty, different faculty from across the universities, nothing to do with Sikhs, but many of them deeply influenced by the Wisconsin incident, will make a statement, 15, 20 minutes, a lecture or so. We'll tape that, put it on the new website. And, those teach-ins are very, very interesting and very informative to a broader body of students. So the challenge is, after the initial condolences, is getting the message out to a much broader public. Right. And to keep that message going. And then we're going to follow up at the end in October with a set of essays contributed by scholars. So people will have had time to think about this particular incident, and to publish essays in Sikh formations. We're going to be collecting about 10 essays which we're going to put out. And then the following year, a year later, hopefully to mark the anniversary of the incident, we want much longer essays, and those will then circulate in the scholarly domain and on the web as well. So who has a final say? These things are ongoing. I mean, I came to New York in the first few days after 9/11, and it was a very traumatic period to enter into New York wearing a turban, and the whole issue has never gone away for me. And nobody has had a final say. Incidents have continued to happen over and over again. And I think something like 700 people have been either attacked or and several killed.
I mean, when this incident happened in Oak Creek, in the UK, we were coming out with some solutions about as one of the things that came out was that in the UK, we're very lucky that the schools visit places of worship. It's now become part of the curriculum, which is not the same in the US. So the idea to go and visit a mosque or a synagogue or a gurdwara has become part of the education system now. It's very unlikely that somebody would not be going from the schools between 8 to 12 at least visiting and understanding it. What about that type of activity? Wouldn't the people that are trying to say let's make some changes about understanding different cultures, one thing is to bring them rather than just isolate all the groups like it seems to be in the States?
Yes, that's something which is ongoing now, actually, and something that has been. I think there's been a strong realization that that's completely lacking. So what I'm seeing on the ground now is a kind of outreach effort by Sikh communities and also by non-Sikh communities to bring Sikh communities into their world. And at the school level, it's something that has to be organized at a more formal level than it is at the moment. I mean, the whole school sector in the US is organized on a strictly secular basis, particularly with public schools. And one of the things I'd like to see is the influence of maybe Sikh chairs or exerting more of an influence than they have at the moment in relation to the school sector. But I don't think the Sikhs are powerful enough to do it on their own. I think we need to get together with other groups, other South Asian groups. This is definitely happening. So there are groups trying to change the image of Sikhs in the textbooks, for example. Not just Sikhs, but also Hindus as well.
All right. I mean, I think we're nearly coming to the end of our time. So the last few minutes that I've got, is there anything that you want to say or touch that I haven't maybe asked? I mean, I know you've come here for just a sort of a holiday and we sort of captured you. I wished it would have been a bit more formal. So I do want to thank you for that. And so is there anything that you want to say now to people that are watching the Sikh channel?
Well, I'm thankful just for having had the opportunity to air my views, talk a little bit about myself and my work. What I would like to say to everybody watching is try to get interested more in what's happening in the Sikh academic realm. It has enormous influence in the coming years at various levels. I mean, Sikh studies, if properly done, can have an important outreach aspect to it, which is not being realized at the moment. So I would ask the community to take more of an interest in possibly creating Sikh chairs here. We need them to influence the higher level of learning at the high end, if you like, at the university sector, which is rather poorly represented here. And that way we can grow scholars who can then have an impact back into the grassroots community, and I think we'll be hopefully moving in the same direction as other groups like the Jews have been doing. I mean, they have a long history of doing this. We're just starting out.
Okay, well, I want to thank Dr Arvind-Pal Singh Mandair for actually talking to us on the Sikh channel. I mean, it's obvious that the work that they've done, I think, just from the books and the journals, I've not come across anybody in the UK academically that has done this type of work. So I want to thank them, and I hope that maybe next time we can have a more sort of formal chit-chat, or even ask them to write some sort of lectures where we can record, even at Michigan. It would be good if our team went there and recorded something. So with that in mind, Arvind, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
In both countries. Sikhs who came to America were very, very well educated when they first came there. A lot of them went into the professional sector. So in the 1970s and 80s, there was a felt need on behalf of the community, on the part of the community, to project a positive image of Sikhs. The Sikhs were not very well known at all in the United States. They were confused and still are confused with Muslims, with Arabs. I think the first occasion where the whole idea of a chair came about was 1976. There was a conference at the University of California, Berkeley, which is organized by Mark Juergensmeyer, who's a leading professor there. That resulted in a major conference on Sikh studies where all the major scholars, including Hugh MacLeod and a number of others, were brought together to discuss issues on Sikh studies. And I think it was Mark Juergensmeyer who put out at that time the idea that there ought to be a Sikh chair, that members of the community should contribute something for the longevity of this, the study of Sikhism, because there were chairs in Hinduism, in Buddhist studies, in Christianity and Judaism. There have been chairs for several hundred years. But this would have been the first chair. So this began, and obviously by the early 80s, you have the political turmoil in Punjab, where Sikhs are now being branded as fundamentalists, as terrorists, etc. So there was a need to change that kind of imagery, and the university was perceived as a place from which some kind of change could happen, partly by bringing the study of Sikhs and Sikhi to the non-Sikh public, as well as I had a philosophy tutor at Warwick and a religions and Sikh studies tutor at the University of London.
Okay, and that was Professor Shackle, was
Professor Christopher Shackle, yes.
Okay. All right, no, let's just talk a couple of minutes about SOAS, where Professor Shackle was, I assume. He's no longer, he's retired now.
No, he's retired.
So is that where all of the Sikh studies in the UK is done, from SOAS, or can you do them from any other university?
Well, SOAS is known as the place where Hugh MacLeod did his PhD. Hugh MacLeod was one of the preeminent scholars of Sikhism from the 1960s onwards, and in fact many regarded him as the kind of founder or the father figure in modern Sikh studies. He did his PhD in 68, I think, from SOAS. It was in Sikh history and it focused on the Janam Sakhis. Incidentally, Professor J.S. Garewal, who's also equally preeminent scholar from Punjab, did his PhD at the University of London, SOAS. That was followed by Christopher Shackle, who was specialised in linguistics, and particularly in languages such as Urdu, Persian, but also in Punjabi. He studied the scriptures. So that laid a foundation for other scholars to sort of come to SOAS to study Sikhi, Punjabi language and related subjects. So SOAS had a history since the late 1960s in this area, and after that, I think in the late 1990s, other universities started to sort of produce scholars who had some kind of a specialization in one aspect of Sikh studies or another.
Okay. I mean, let's talk about the chair that you actually hold as the Associate Professor at the University of Michigan. Mm-hmm. Now, when I was searching, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Today, actually, we're having an interview session with Dr Arvind Singh Mandair, and they used to live in Coventry, and they've moved to the States. So today's program will be to discuss about the academics in the Sikh world and about what they have done. And I think you will be quite surprised at the amount of information that they've put out in terms of books, journals, and all the other work that we're going to hopefully talk to Arvind about. So first of all, let me introduce Arvind to everybody. Arvind, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So welcome to the show. And let's first start just by talking about your background and growing up in the UK, especially here in Coventry. So why don't you start by telling me,
Sure.
when you came over, your parents and your brothers and sisters and so on, and where you studied.
First of all, thank you for having me on the Sikh Channel. It's an honour. I'm very humbled. I came to the UK in 1966 with my parents. I was about two and a half years old at the time. I remember, well, I don't remember much, but I remember getting off the plane and actually feeling the cold of a new country. After that, I grew up. I went to a Church of England primary school. I was influenced, obviously, by the heavily Christian atmosphere that I was educated in. Then went to a grammar school, King Henry VIII Grammar School in Coventry, which was established in 1545. It's one of the oldest grammar schools. And after that, my education was at the Coventry University. Then I went to Aston University to do a PhD in chemistry. I was married at the age of, I can't remember the age I was married, I was about 27 or so.
For chairs, and we'll try to explain to the Sikh Channel Sangat exactly what a chair means. There is no chair of the equivalent that you're doing in the States, and there's about 6 or 7 here in the UK. So can you just explain what this whole chair means, and why is it that we haven't got one in the UK?
Yes, it's quite a long-winded sort of answer that I'm going to give you. So a chair is an endowed position. So you can have a chair, for example, in mathematics, in religion, and this one happens to be in Sikh studies. The idea of a chair is that it's an endowed position which is made permanent through a major contribution from a donor, and that donor can be the community, or it can be a single relatively affluent person who gives a donation, let's say of $1 million, $2 million, pounds, whatever. That then endows a position, a faculty position, for somebody to be able to become a permanent faculty member in perpetuity, basically. What the university does is to advertise that position worldwide. There is a long-winded search where people compete for that position, so a lot of people are interviewed, and obviously the most suitable person will get that position. That doesn't tell you what a chair actually does, which I'll go into more as we get into this particular discussion.
Okay, but why is it then that, so in America, if a family or the community has put up enough funds for it, then they can set up a chair in Sikh studies?
Yes.
So what is it that in the UK that we haven't been able to set a chair up to study for the Sikh faith?
It has something to do with the relationship between the Sikh community and the university. So, to Preet Mahinder Kaur from India. We have been happily married ever since. After that, I changed my academic field from chemistry to Sikh studies and philosophy. So I went into the study of philosophy at the University of Warwick, and I actually had a job there at the time, studying philosophy. Actually, before that, I was doing superconductors at the University of Warwick. I had a research fellowship and was in the physics department. After that, I really got into affairs in the UK Sikh community. There was so much going on. This was the late 80s, early 90s. So much politics going on, and there's a misrepresentation of Sikhi in the air. And it was impossible not to get involved. I decided then to change my subject area from science to study philosophy, which became my base discipline. I took a master's in philosophy at the University of Warwick. This was while I was still a research fellow there. So I was holding down one job and then studying on the other hand. And then after that, I decided to go on and do a PhD in philosophy and Sikh studies, and that took about I think from 1991 to about 1998 to make that transition complete. Would you like me to say?
Yes. What is what? I mean, did you study in? You did your PhD in Warwick University.
I did my first PhD in chemistry at Aston University.
Right.
And the first PhD was in Aston, the second was at the University of Warwick, but it was a combined PhD where